Hi, I'm Eric Mill. I'm a senior advisor with the Office of Management and Budget. I work for the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer, headed by Claire Martirana. Thank you so much for having me here today to talk about the draft federal zero trust strategy that our office released a couple of weeks ago for public comment. There's a number of things in it that are quite relevant to authentication and the goals of this conference. So I'm happy to what I plan on doing is going over the strategy in general, which covers some other things besides identity and authentication, and then I'll really drill into identity and talk a little bit more about what it is we're trying to accomplish there and what we're asking federal agencies to do. For a little bit of background, for those who aren't familiar, the Office of Management and Budget, it's a part of the Executive Office of the President, and we oversee federal agencies. And so the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer is responsible for technology and cybersecurity policies that govern federal agencies and how they do business. In this year, in 2021, we're also part of implementing Executive Order 14028, which is sometimes for shorthand referred to as the Cybersecurity Executive Order, and at least this year, and it covers a number of different goals and requirements for the federal government for raising the bar on federal cybersecurity. Among those things, EO 14028 requires that the federal government move decisively and ambitiously towards a zero trust architecture. And zero trust as a topic, as a term, really means, you can get a few different definitions depending who you ask or different emphases. When we talk about zero trust, we're talking about an architecture where people and their devices aren't trusted just by virtue of being inside of an organization's enterprise network, but instead an architecture where people and devices are validated, they have their security validated tightly at each step, that authentication is context aware, and that fundamentally we are moving away from a perimeter-based security model where security is, where authentication is sort of performed once at the outside, and then at the outside typically of a network connection, and then sort of trusted inside of an intranet and enterprise environment. So that is something we're trying to move away from as a federal government. For this to work, authentication, strong authentication, is at the core of that, of being able to create an architecture like that. So OMB's draft strategy here places a really heavy emphasis on authentication, on consolidating around single sign-on services and around strong phishing-resistant authentication. That is, as I'll get into in a little bit, phishing is something we want to tackle clearly and decisively. So with that, I will jump into what it is we're trying to do. So I'm going to go through the document that we released. This document is readable at zerotrust.cyber.gov. You can go there and visit the federal zero trust strategy. You can read this. You can download a PDF, or you can read this in web-friendly form. So I'm going to go through this document in chunks and talk about pieces of it. So as an overview, as I mentioned, we're implementing Executive Order 14028 to move the part of it dealing with moving the federal government to a zero trust architecture. We understand this is going to be a pretty major paradigm shift for the federal government, not just for the federal government. This is something that is a big shift for enterprises across the world, but the federal government is no exception to that. Here we're referencing the Zero Trust Reference Architecture that the Department of Defense published, which really emphasizes that no actor, system, or network or service within the security perimeter should be considered trusted just by being in that perimeter. Right? So the way that we're trying to tackle that in a focused, practical way is that we are trying to bolster strong identity practices across federal agencies. We're really pushing towards encryption in transit and at rest where appropriate, to enforce the guarantees that these systems are supposed to have, and a focus on application testing, like application level guarantees. We also want to make sure that federal agencies can recognize every device and resource that they have, and we want to nudge our federal agencies towards intelligent automation of security actions. And finally, we really continue to emphasize robust and safe use of cloud services, including commercial cloud services inside the federal government as part of this. Some of our key goals here, we're within, Executive Order 14028 actually is quite explicit about multi-factor authentication and encryption, as well as other key security properties such as universal logging, endpoint detection and response, and you'll see some of those things reflected in what we do. But fundamentally, everything that we're talking about here is about avoiding implicit trust and being aware of what you have, and just fundamentally elevating the principle of least privilege, which is a ancient security principle that we are really advocating, taking to its logical conclusion. So we've really organized our zero trust strategy in 5 sections, and these are aligned with the 5 sort of pillars of zero trust that the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, that they have aligned their zero trust maturity model around. So those 5 pillars are identity, devices, networks, applications, and data. So I'll go over each of the 5 sections and what we're hoping to accomplish in each of those. So when it comes to the identity section, and I will come back to this after going through all 5 and dig in a little deeper here for this audience, but the identity section is really twofold. One is about consolidating agency identity systems as much as possible and really relying on single sign-on services throughout federal enterprises, which includes cloud services, using things like SAML and OpenID Connect and others. And those things that we consolidate to, what we rely on for single sign-on across agency enterprises, we want to set a clear goal that agencies need to be enforcing multi-factor authentication at the application level, not at the network or VPN level. And that when they do this, that they're enforcing this through phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, which I will get into. And we also require this happen for public basic systems as well, but there we require phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication be an option. So I'll come back to this. Finally, we're also asking agencies to fully adopt password policies that are known to make passwords secure. Part of multi-factor authentication when passwords are in use is, when passwords are there, they're a factor and need to be strong. And so we have a number of requirements we're asking agencies to follow through on relating to password strength. So I'll come back to this in a little bit. So we also have a section here on devices, and fundamentally what we're looking to emphasize here for federal agencies is really that they have a complete inventory of their devices that they operate and authorize for government work, which could be bring your own device or it could be devices issued by the agency, and that they are fully capable of detecting and responding to incidents on those devices. What we're emphasizing here is that agencies really have to participate in CISA's Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, or CDM. CDM is a long-standing program to aid in the monitoring of assets within federal environments, and it has been around for some time, and it does already see adoption throughout the federal government, but there are gaps. And so this was part of Executive Order 14028, that agencies need to all participate in this program. And so we are emphasizing this and providing some guidance to them on doing so, as well as really emphasizing that the operators of the CDM program at CISA also need to make sure to adapt the CDM program more fully around the principle of least privilege and to assume compromise of their own infrastructure, that can happen, and to more fully prioritize their use in cloud-based infrastructure, since that is where agencies are going and are making use of cloud infrastructure that, for example, may make use of things that are not long-lived servers and may include serverless infrastructure and containers and other things like that. Finally, we want agencies to fully deploy endpoint detection and response tools across their fleet. This is an area where we're not saying that agencies all need to adapt the same endpoint detection and response tool all across the federal government, but rather that they do need to have something, and where there are gaps and agencies need support, CISA will work with them to do that, and that agencies will also, whatever they may use, will need to provide CISA with ongoing access to that data. So on On networks, we are really focusing heavily here on encryption, which was a focus of the executive order and has been a focus of our office at OMB for some time. There are any number of protocols, of network protocols, that we could focus on. However, we are focusing here in this strategy on a couple of protocols that are really critical to enterprise operations and enterprise security. One of those is DNS, and we're asking agencies to fully migrate to using encrypted DNS wherever it is technically supported, which is most places, either now or in the very near future. So by this we mean DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS. We also are asking agencies to enforce HTTPS for anything inside their environment. It has been the policy of the US government for a number of years now that anything on the public web that speaks HTTP needs to enforce HTTPS, but this has not been the case for intranet services. And consistent with zero trust architecture principles, we are proposing to ask agencies to enforce that fully throughout their environment. We're also trying to tackle email encryption in transit by asking CISA to work with the FedRAMP program to evaluate a somewhat recent protocol called MTA STS, MTA Strict Transport Security, to evaluate whether that could be a viable government-wide solution. This is acknowledging that the space is a little bit less formed and less settled than in the DNS and HTTPS spaces, but that it is a priority for the government to figure this out. And finally, we're asking agencies to really tackle network segmentation in a fulsome way and to work with CISA to develop a plan over the next few years that they can submit to us to oversee as they implement it. With applications, we are really leaning in on empirical validation of security. We're asking agencies to, agencies do, to be clear, operate dedicated security testing programs today. Where we are really emphasizing here is a greater investment in not just automated scanning tools, but more sophisticated, bespoke manual analysis of security vulnerabilities within their environment. To that goal, we want agencies to more consistently use third-party firms that specialize in this kind of work. We're asking CISA and GSA to work together on a procurement vehicle to help make this an easier reality for agencies. And then in addition to third-party testing, we're also asking agencies to really invest in their public vulnerability disclosure programs. Agencies have been rolling out public vulnerability disclosure programs and welcoming reports from public security researchers. They need to continue to do this, and CISA is providing a vulnerability disclosure platform to agencies that a number of agencies have begun to adopt recently. CISA will continue rolling that out to different agencies and making it easier for agency system owners to directly engage with members of the public who are reporting issues. We're also asking agencies to begin the process of embracing this mentality of their assets being treated as internet accessible by taking at least one sensitive internal application and making it accessible over the public internet using the enterprise single sign-on controls that we talked about previously. Then finally, we're asking CISA and GSA to more fully invest in work that they've begun over the last few years to really trawl the internet, both public and sources as well as commercial sources and a few internal sources, to find what the US government, find what different agencies have online, whether they know it or not, and to let them know about them and keep that as sort of a regular ongoing oversight and reality check mechanism. So that's something where it is just sort of something that we need to be doing as a government. And at the size of the US government, it's very helpful when you have an agency like CISA who can go out and do that on behalf of everybody else. So finally, in our data section, we're really pushing agencies to grapple with the need to categorize the different documents and data that they have inside their organization, and to begin automating processes that currently are often done manually within the federal government. This is a tricky area for some agencies who have not invested in automation to the degree that you may have seen out in the private sector in some places. It is where we have to go, and some agencies in general throughout this zero trust architecture push are at different levels of maturity in all of these issues, and some agencies have done quite a bit in this area. But sophisticated automation and monitoring and heuristics are a place we're going to invest in over the next few years as part of implementing data level protections for information. All right, so with that, let's jump back into the identity section and dig into a couple things that we're doing here. So I mentioned that we're asking agencies to really consolidate around a small number of enterprise single sign-on systems. As part of that, I mean, agencies have more identity systems than you may expect. Many federal agencies are actually quite decentralized, and it's just not always the case that you have this one consistent identity provider that sprawls all the way up to the enterprise. And so we're asking agencies to get much closer to that ideal than they are today, and to reduce the number of systems they have. And this is for basic things like being able to reliably offboard employees and consistently revoke access across the fleet, across the enterprise. But it's also something that just as a practical matter is going to, consolidation around fewer systems is going to make it much easier for agencies to do the work that we're going to ask them to do around phishing resistant authentication and other things. So let's just jump right into that. So we're pushing very hard on multi-factor authentication. And we really view reliable authentication as a critical foundation of zero trust architecture. We also know that phishing, and including spear phishing of enterprises, is an ongoing tremendous problem in the world. That's a common foothold within an organization to conduct more expansive attacks. And what we know is that the technology exists to dramatically reduce or eliminate the opportunities to do that, at least with federal systems that we control and can implement these mechanisms. So at a basic level, we're asking federal agencies to integrate multi-factor authentication at the application level, as opposed to other layers of the stack, like the network layer. And we just generally are asking agencies to just de-emphasize network level authentication and to eventually remove it in their enterprise, right? And we expect users to be logging into applications. Single sign-on can make it so you don't have to keep logging into every application all the time, but we want that to be happening at the application layer. We also are calling out very specifically here that not all multi-factor authentication is made equal, right? So multi-factor authentication in general will protect against reused credentials or weak password guessing. But as this audience is perhaps familiar with, many approaches to multi-factor authentication just don't protect against phishing attacks as they are operated in the world today, particularly when they're going after higher value targets, of which the US government is one. So we know that that there are automated phishing tools out there that can fool users into providing their one-time codes or into engaging in pressing push notifications that they believe are to the real thing, but are actually being used into a phishing site. So, and we know that these attacks can be automated and operate cheaply. So this is something where we want to set the baseline for the US government at a place where we know that's not feasible. Right? And so there's actually, this isn't just isn't just a discussion about web authentication. Right? So as you can tell, we talk about web authentication here in this document. One thing that's important to understand, though, is that the federal government widely uses PIV, personal identity verification. They use PIV devices. They usually often come in the form of cards that you can see other forms that are used for host level and web and internet level authentication inside the federal government. And those cards, the PIV in general, is a phishing resistant protocol. Right? These make use of client certificates that are bound, the client certificate based TLS connections that are bound to the connection being used, and they cannot easily be phished. So that's a great leg up that the federal government has that not every enterprise does. And PIV devices are used widely throughout the federal government. So when those are used and enforced, and where there is no routine fallback mechanism that can be exploited by an adversary, those will meet this requirement. However, that's in practice, there are many places within the federal government today where PIV is not used or is infeasible in some way, at least in the near term. And so what we are asking is that when it comes to enterprise-facing systems, that those systems, however they achieve it, achieve phishing-resistant authentication, relying on the definition of verifier impersonation resistance that NIST Special Publication 863 specifies, and enforcing that across the board. So we also we do touch here on public-facing authentication. So basically everything else in this document is pretty firmly oriented around internal sort of enterprise-facing systems. However, this is an area where it's really hard to fully just detach and have a clean line between public-facing and non-public-facing systems. We know that from an interoperability perspective, it's really helpful to be making consistent options, offering consistent options to users, whether they're in a work or personal context. We also know that just systems in the government that are public-facing, they are often quite sensitive to enterprise security. They can include systems that are actually processing background investigations of people who will be government employees but are not yet. They can be systems that are processing the financial information of vendors and people who contract with the government. These are things that may technically be public-facing, but are really quite, they function in many ways as enterprise operations. So it's really not reasonable today to require phishing-resistant authentication for the general public without providing other options. This is a thing you can see across the web and the internet today. But what we can do, and what we should do, is reliably offer the option of phishing-resistant authentication in public-facing systems in the government that have multi-factor authentication. Right? So, and in general, because you cannot expect members of the general public to have a PIV device or a common access card device is a common equivalent of the Department of Defense, agencies are going to have to meet this requirement likely using web authentication based protocols, where web authentication, as I may not need to explain to this group, is a W3C specification that describes on various APIs that can allow phishing-resistant authentication frameworks to be used on the web. And then finally, we're giving some straightforward guidance around strong password policies. So for several years now, NIST Special Publication 863b has made clear, based on extensive public research, that what have become common enterprise patterns in password policies are not as secure as people thought, and in fact tend to reduce security. So essentially, they have been backfiring, and this is at this point a fairly widely known thing. And so we're really just emphasizing here that these policies, including special character class requirements, periodic password rotation, regardless of evidence of compromise, that these things it is time for them to go in the federal government. So another thing that we know is extremely important and helpful to password security is checking passwords against known compromised password databases, things that have been taken from breaches. Right? At this point, there are huge collections of breached credentials that have come through public and private breaches. And these data sets exist on the internet. They're public, and they can be used to check incoming user passwords at login time, at password reset time, to make sure that they're secure and have not already been compromised. This is a pattern that we would like to see used in the federal government. It's not common at the moment, and it should be. So this is something where we're asking CISA to investigate creating a shared service to help agencies do this, a service to help them check user passwords against known breach data, and to do so in a way that doesn't actually expose the plain text of the password to the service. There are ways of doing this that folks in the private sector and academia have explored, such as k-anonymity and other similar approaches to do this. And so we want that service to exist. And then we want agencies to use that or another similar service to really implement this protection across their fleet of applications or across their single sign-on services, of which we're asking them to consolidate to a very small number. So this is all available to read on zerotrust.cyber.gov. As I said, we published the federal zero trust strategy there as a PDF and as a website. We recently asked for feedback from the public. The comment window for that just closed, but we had it out for public comment for multiple weeks as we wanted to make the draft strategy as strong as possible. So even though our public comment window is closed, you'll notice there's a couple of other documents up there, including a zero trust maturity model that CISA has published, also for public comment. The maturity model is meant to complement our federal zero trust strategy and describes sort of a general arc of maturity in these 5 pillars that agencies should achieve, and how CISA's shared services will contribute to those or do already. Their public comment period is not done and is open until October 1st, 2021. So if you have any comments you want to submit to them, I encourage you to reach out to them at, you can see the email there, it's tic, at cisa.dhs.gov. And that is everything I wanted to say. Thank you again so much for having me here to talk about the draft federal zero trust strategy and what we're doing on identity and authentication. All right, thanks very much and take care.